being incarcerated. The term mass incarceration seems to be somewhat misleading because it suggests a random expansion of the prison system, which actually hasn't happened. If we look at the racial composition of the prison population, we realize that this huge penal experiment has been very selective. African American men are incarcerated 6 times more than white men and 3 times more often than Hispanic men. So here you see the lifetime chances of being sent to prison at current incarceration rates in the United States. So how can we explain this sudden and dramatic increase in the prison population? This was the question that I had at the time. How can we make sense of its concentration on the most vulnerable fractions of the American population? The obvious answer would be crime. People tend to think that punishment is a consequence of crime, that you have crime first and then punishment. That crime is the cause of punishment, or punishment is the consequence of crime. Now, as criminologists know, most of them at least, this is really an unlikely explanation for the punitive turn. Crime has been increasing during the 1960s, particularly property crime, but then between the mid-70s and the early 2000s, virtually all types of criminal activity have been relatively stable or declining, with the exception of violent crime in the 1980s, which was related mostly to the crack economy associated with the war on crack. So, in other words, the prison population has been growing constantly, whether crime was increasing, decreasing, or stable, at least since 1973. So we need to look somewhere else. What has changed since the 1970s is not crime, but the politics, the economics, and the culture of punishment in the United States. So the political economy of punishment is an attempt to produce a structural explanation of penal change. The basic hypothesis of the political economy of punishment is that punishment is a tool of class control, that it is a set of power strategies for regulating the poor. Therefore, in order to understand the transformations of penal systems, both historically and in contemporary societies, we need to look at the transformations of the economy, an economy which happens to be a capitalist economy. We have to look at the system of production. We have to look at the labor market, unemployment rates, underemployment. We have to look at the relationships between capital and labor, levels of unionization, the relative strength of the labor force as opposed to capital. We have to look at modes of economic regulation. How strong is state intervention in the economy, or how deregulated is the economy, and so on. Finally, we have to look at the dominant modes of regulating the poor, so to speak. Whether there is a welfare state in charge of regulating the poor in a non-punitive way, or relatively non-punitive way, or whether there is no welfare state and therefore the only tool for regulating the poor is the penal system. So the broad hypothesis of the political economy of punishment is that each system or mode of production, feudalism, manufacture, capitalism, late capitalism, each of those modes of production tends to discover, so to speak, forms of punitive regulation of the poor that are consistent with the existing economic and class structure. A famous definition of the political economy of punishment is found in one of the sort of path-breaking articles in the field by Georg Busse in 1933. He put it very clearly. He said, every system of production tends to discover punishments which correspond to its productive relationships. It is thus necessary to investigate the origins and fate of penal systems, the use or avoidance of specific punishments, and the intensity of penal practices, as they are determined by social forces, and above all, by economic and then physical forces. This is what Georg Busse had to say in 1933. So in other words, the penal system in this perspective is seen as a weapon, let's say, in class struggle. Punishment, or more specifically, the threat of punishment, has been used throughout history to force the poor to accept the existing conditions of labor division and social inequality. capitalists have unleashed the penal system periodically against the poor and workers in order to curb any attempt at resisting exploitation and challenging the existing structure of power and subordination. Remember the history of the labor movement and ongoing use of the penal system and police against the labor movement. So the political economy of punishment looks at punishment both historically and under a contemporary perspective. So historically, what the political economy of punishment has done is it has attempted to produce what is called a revisionist history of punishment, a history of punishment that is not the mainstream historiography of the prison, for example, or historiography of punishment. The mainstream histories of punishment suggest, for example, that the prison was born as an attempt to humanize punishment, to abandon the barbaric practices of corporal punishment, and that the prison represented a progress, somehow an affirmation of human rights where there was none before. So the revisionist history of punishment suggests that the invention of the prison has nothing to do, or not as much to do with human rights and progress as mainstream historians suggest. Instead, the invention of the penitentiary played a major role in the emergence of a capitalist society. There seems to be a structural analogy and historical correspondence between the emergence of the factory as the main site of capitalist production during the Industrial Revolution, and the prison as the central site of punishment in the same period, and by the way, in the same societies, England and the United States. The population of prisons and factories has traditionally been, let's say, able-bodied poor. Between the 18th and the 19th century, capitalists who had been accumulating their capitals through commerce and the exploitation of imperial colonies possessed almost all that they needed in order to establish their industries, to establish a new system of production that would be the manufacture and then the factory. But in order for a capitalist system to be set in motion, something very important was still needed that they didn't have, and that was an obedient and disciplined labor force. So how was this labor force created, and where did it come from? This is the main question that the political economy of punishment tries to ask when looking at the history of the prison. That labor force came from the countryside. It would be largely made of desperately poor peasants who were forced by the enclosures of common land in England between the 17th and 19th century, and by technological advancements in agriculture, to leave the countryside. They were forced to leave the countryside and move into the industrializing cities of northern England, Birmingham, Manchester, close to Kiel, by the way, to survive. Poor peasants were chased out of the common lands where they had been surviving for centuries. An entire economy of subsistence had been destroyed by the intense exploitation of land for pastures, which became crucial for the production of wool in the age of the steam-powered loom invented by Cartwright in 1785. And this gave rise to a huge migration of poor peasants to the industrializing cities of northern England. So, deprived of their means of production and of their means of subsistence, these hordes of rightless proletarians, as Karl Marx called them in Capital, in his first volume of Capital, they were turned into beggars, vagabonds, prostitutes, alcoholics, thieves, and so on. Corporal punishment was at first used against these people to terrorize them and to neutralize the danger that they posed for the well-being of the cities. But then corporal punishment was abandoned between the 18th and 19th century not as a consequence of enlightened reforms or humanitarian sentiments, but simply because it had become dysfunctional. It had become dysfunctional to the emerging capitalist economy. The human body had now become a source of value, a commodity itself. It needed to be disciplined and put to work instead of being wasted in useless spectacles of suffering, as had been the case until that point. So the birth of the prison was a necessary complement to the emergence of industrial capitalism. Its major role was the production of a disciplined capitalist labor force out of the masses of poor vagrants, dispossessed peasants, criminals, prostitutes, alcoholics, who were initially tortured, dismembered, and punished corporally, but who then became the main targets of what Michel Foucault called the Great Confinement in his Discipline and Punish. So the new institutions of confinement, workhouses, poorhouses, Rascues in Holland, and you know, all this will become the total institutions. They would discipline the poor to follow orders from prison officials, to conform to the rules of the prison, to become reliable workers in the prison labor, to learn the discipline of time, which they ignored, and to become an obedient and docile labor force. So the political economy of punishment looks at the history of punishment through these lenses, but then it tries to apply the same concepts to contemporary forms of punishment. So let's turn to our present. How can the political economy of punishment help us understand, let's call it the second great confinement that has been going on in the United States and to a lesser extent in other Western countries since the mid-70s? There is a golden rule of the political economy of punishment, which is really sort of a logical complement to the main idea of punishment. And the golden rule of the political economy of punishment is the principle of less eligibility. It's very simple. The idea is that people should never prefer punishment over conformity to the law. That's the deterrent effect of punishment that we keep invoking, basically. So the principle of less eligibility is once again very well explained by Georg Rusche, who says, experience teaches us that most crimes are committed by members of those strata who are burdened by strong social pressures and who are relatively disadvantaged in satisfying their needs when compared to other classes. So basically he's saying the poor are the ones that we establish punishments for. Therefore, a penal sanction, if it is not to be counterproductive, must be constituted in such a way that the classes which are most criminally inclined, remember, he was writing in 1930, so he thought that we were classes that were criminally inclined. But anyway, the poor will prefer to abstain from the forbidden acts than become victims of criminal punishment. So, in other words, if the prison is essentially an instrument for regulating and disciplining the poor, if the prison population is disproportionately constituted by poor, undereducated, unemployed, socially marginalized classes, if the historical role of the prison has been to turn the able-bodied poor into a labor force suitable to be employed in the capitalist industries, it follows that in order to perform this role, which is to deter the poor from resorting to crimes of survival and to force them to accept any given condition of oppression, standards of living for those who are punished must be in any case significantly worse than the standards of living available to the working poor, to those at the bottom of the class structure. So what are the consequences of this principle, which looks quite elementary, like rather obvious, for our analysis of penal change? There's many consequences of this principle. First, there is a structural relationship between the inside and the outside of prisons. In other words,